The 1930s were a time of uncertainty. The countries of Europe were still recovering from World War I, and Germany was suffering the effects of both the war and the Treaty of Versailles, which imposed harsh penalties on the country, plummeting it into economic depression. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party took the opportunity to seize power in Germany and break the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler broke the treaty by rearming for war and invading other countries. Though most people were oblivious to this threat, one man was not. Winston Churchill. Churchill took a stand against Hitler and Nazi Germany despite great risks to his professional reputation, by warning Britain of the dangers they faced from Germany. In 1932, Churchill knew the Germans were preparing to go to war, so he proposed to Parliament that they at once start preparing for war. This, however, was not a notion many people wanted to follow because the bloodshed of World War I was fresh in the minds of many British. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, a pacifist, proposed appeasing Germany. He believed that if they gave Hitler what he wanted, he would stop attacking other countries. Churchill thought otherwise. He said, if you give a dictator what he wants, he'll demand more. In the end, Churchill was right, and his leadership eventually helped Britain prevail over its enemies. However, if they had listened to Churchill, Britain could have possibly stopped Hitler in World War II before millions of people lost their lives. As Churchill told President Roosevelt, World War II was the unnecessary war. There never was a war more easy to stop than that which has just wrecked what was left of the world from the previous struggle. Churchill faced many risks by taking a stand. He could lose his reputation, his political position, and many friends by taking an unpopular position. There was a sequence of events in Churchill's life, from his learning to fend for himself at a young age, to being extremely brave in the Boer and First World War, and to the pressure of the political arena that prepared him to take a stand at this crucial moment. Churchill was born on November 30th, 1874, to an aristocratic family with a long tradition of public service. He was first elected to Parliament in the 1900s, and from 1908 to 1911, Churchill rose to power. He supervised the Navy and was responsible for passing many acts that improved the welfare of the public. Churchill returned to the Conservative Party in 1924, but from 1930 to 1939, Churchill experienced what most call his wilderness years, where he had little political influence and spent a great deal of time writing, painting, and traveling. In the early 1930s, he began warning of the Nazi threat to England and Europe after witnessing the Nazis' actions in Germany. In 1932, Churchill published an article in the Daily Mail where he asked if England could defend itself. In response, his colleagues and general public shunned him. In 1933, Churchill continued to warn Parliament, saying, "Those Germans aren't looking for equal status. They're looking for weapons. Germany is arming. She is arming rapidly, and no one will stop her." In 1935, Churchill advocated that the British should support the League of Nations, which had the duty of trying to resolve international disputes. Churchill knew that if England supported the League, that they would be able to eradicate the Nazi threat. Throughout this time, most members of Parliament and the English public hated having another war after 1 million British men were killed only 20 years earlier in World War I. Many friends tried to convince Churchill that Germany wasn't arming for war. For example, his cousin, Lord Londonderry, wrote to him saying, "I should like to get of your mind what appears to be a strong anti-German obsession. England appeared ready to ignore the fact that Germany was arming for war." Even with this opposition, Churchill still tried to convince England to rearm. He knew that England could afford to rearm, and if they did, they would be able to stop Germany before it got too powerful. On November 12, 1936, Churchill stated, "The government simply cannot make up their mind, or they cannot get the Prime Minister to make up his mind. So they go on in strange paradox, decided only to be undecided, resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, all-powerful for impotency. As so we go on, preparing more months, more years, precious, perhaps vital for the greatness of Britain, for the locusts to eat." In 1937, Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister. His policy, which was very popular in England, was to appease Hitler. He forced out or overruled everyone out of the cabinet who opposed him and his idea of appeasement. On March 12, 1938, Hitler invaded Austria and annexed it to Germany. Chamberlain was willing to give up Austria if it meant keeping good relations with Hitler and Nazi Germany. Churchill, on the other hand, predicted that the day will come when you will have to make a stand, and I pray to God that when that day comes, we may not find through an unwise policy that we have to make that stand alone. Once Hitler obtained Austria, he set his sights on Czechoslovakia. On September 12, 1938, Churchill proposed that they should tell Germany that if they set foot in Czechoslovakia, we should at once be at war with her. On September 30th, 1938, in Munich, Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler, and Chamberlain said that they would give him the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia. When Chamberlain returned, the English public cheered, and he told them that he had made peace in our time. Churchill called the appeasement policy a defeat without a war. A lone voice in the wilderness, Churchill said. Chamberlain had the choice between war and shame. Now he has chosen shame. He'll get war later. On October 3rd, Parliament began debating the Munich Agreement. Churchill rose at 5:10 and spoke for 45 minutes. Churchill stated, "We have sustained a total defeat." Churchill continued with, "The German dictator, instead of snatching the victuals from the table, has been content to have them served to him course by course. Regarding England, he says, this is only the beginning of the reckoning. This is only the first sip, the first foretaste of a bitter cup which will be proffered to us year by year, unless by supreme recovery of moral health and martial vigor we arise again and take our stand for freedom as in the olden time." Churchill said that the words on Czechoslovakia were barely out of his mouth before the Nazi atrocities upon the Jewish population resounded throughout the civilized world. Between November 9th and 10th, 400 synagogues were burned and over 7,500 Jewish shops were destroyed during what was called as Kristallnacht. Churchill claimed that Germany showed no resemblance to a civilized country because of Hitler's hatred to the Jews and the murder of them that he ordered. On March 15, 1939, Hitler broke the Munich Agreement by invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. This action destroyed any possible idea of appeasement, although Chamberlain and his allies still believed in the idea of appeasement for several months. After the invasion of Czechoslovakia, Britain started waking up to the danger of Nazi aggression and started pressuring Chamberlain to change the government's course to follow Churchill's suggestions. At this time, although Chamberlain knew that war was inevitable, he still tried to prevent it while taking some steps to prepare England for war. 2 days later, Neville Chamberlain created the Ministry of Supply, which Churchill advocated creating in 1936, 3 years before. German soldiers invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. The invasion was the spark that started World War II. On September 2nd, Britain and France told Germany that if they didn't leave Poland, that they would declare war. Hitler ignored this warning, and on September 3rd, 1939, Neville Chamberlain announced to the British public that they were at war with Germany. Chamberlain was pressured to resign because Parliament thought he didn't have the necessary skills to lead them through World War II. On May 10th, George VI appointed Winston Churchill Prime Minister, where he took his greatest stand, leading his country and the Allies to victory against the Axis powers. Some historians argue that appeasement was a way to buy England time to rearm, but in the end they didn't use the time bought with appeasement to rearm. Even after Anschluss, Chamberlain's views on appeasement still had a lot of support. Historian R.A.C. Parker argues that Chamberlain further believed that the opponents of his appeasement policy would provoke Hitler, or those who might otherwise restrain him, into violence. Germany could have been contained at the beginning of the 1930s had Parliament responded to Churchill's argument that Germany was arming for war and posed a threat to England and the rest of the world. The horrid events brought on by their conquest of Europe could have been prevented, and the millions of Jews and others who were murdered in Hitler's concentration camps might have been saved. Churchill himself says that for Britain to have created an air power which would have imposed the necessary restraints upon Hitler's ambition, or would perhaps have enabled the military leaders of Germany to control his violent acts, more than 5 whole years had yet to run before we confronted with the supreme ordeal. Had we acted now with reasonable prudence and healthy energy, it might never have come to pass. Based upon superior air power, Britain and France could safely have invoked the aid of the League of Nations, and all the states of Europe would have gathered behind them.